Have you ever been in a situation where you really wanted to do something, but your inner voices got in the way? Maybe you wanted to speak to that girl that you liked at the coffee shop, or you wanted to ask your boss for a promotion for the end of the year, but you began overthinking, getting in your head, so you asked your friends and family what you should do. And they said, hey man, just be confident, right? It's all about confidence. And maybe you thought to yourself, that sounds great, but how do I build confidence? In today's episode of the Data Driven Actualization podcast, we uncover the just be confident scam. And we unravel how you can actually find the inner confidence you already had deep down. How this process is not about building something you don't have, but it's about remembering something that you always had. Hope you enjoy this episode and let me know what you think down in the comments. Welcome back to the Data Driven Actualization podcast. Another surprise episode. Dr. Namer, what's today's subject?
Yeah, so today's subject is something that almost soared to popularity right when I kind of started getting into self-development.
Okay.
And then it's almost like that train of thought merged into what people refer to now as like inner work. Mm-hmm. And it suddenly became very mainstream. Mm-hmm. But back in 2016, 2017, it was all about confidence. Mm-hmm. And so given kind of your progression coaching as well as progression learning about various psychological frameworks, mm-hmm. I figured we really run through this from almost the first principles, mm-hmm. because I feel like confidence was once viewed as this magic pill, like mm-hmm. that's the thing that fixes like everything.
Right.
But then it was also just different people would define it differently. Mm-hmm. And then everyone would kind of claim that their method could give them confidence. Mm-hmm. So I figured we really break this down from a belief level, as well as given our previous chat around things such as the nature of reality, really tie in the role of confidence in our journey to actualization, mm-hmm. and see if we can talk about where it does help and where it actually doesn't help, and when the solution may be to actually just do mm-hmm. some more reps and build more skill versus when it can really help us.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I don't know how to start with that, but I think the first thing to say is a lot of people see confidence as something to build.
Yeah.
And I think it's more something to find inside ourselves.
Yeah.
Because the way you define that is very different, right? The first language assumes that by nature we don't have confidence and we have to build it over time.
Yeah.
Like building a muscle. Whereas the second framing, where you find your internal confidence, assumes that it is something you had at some point, but it's something you lose touch with over time through your experience of life. And I found the second approach to be a lot more long-term, in the sense that our own nature is to be in a place where our mind is clear, we are acting with confidence, and we have stories that empower who we are and who we want to be. And I think that's where, when this idea of building confidence was very popular, it was kind of presented in a way where people could learn the skills to display confident behavior. But a lot of the teachings, I think, fell short when it came to understanding the underlying pattern that was pulling people back to lack of confidence.
Yeah. And so if we're going to talk about finding our inner confidence, let's start by rigorously defining it, because I remember one of the books you'd recommended I read was Define Confidence as a Positive Expectation over Uncertainty. But something that really tripped me up was almost like, you can't have, I'm not a fortune teller. And so that's where I would almost get confused, would be, well, I can't predict the future. And so if I want, am I expected to just guess that things will go well? But then I think the other thing that also confused me was, well, do I want to have a positive expectation over my input or over the output? So do I want to choose to have a positive expectation that I will show up and be able to perform my best, or be my best? Or do I want to show up and have a positive expectation that the outcome will be a certain way?
Right.
So given kind of all these considerations, how do you think of confidence?
Yeah, I think confidence comes from the alignment of knowing what you want and trusting your ability to go after what you want.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily as much about the outcome itself. It's
Yeah.
more like a internal metric for yourself,
Yeah.
right? And the external metric might be different
Yeah.
because people set different goals for themselves. And in a way, you can feel very confident without actually being competent at a subject. And that's not what we're trying to promote here, right?
Yeah.
We want to be competent and confident. But what's interesting is some of the most competent people, because of imposter syndrome, usually end up becoming the least confident because they know so much, and there's that bell curve of like how much you actually know and then how much you think you know, right?
Yeah.
And the person who usually, I forget the name of the theory.
Dunning-Kruger?
Yeah, the person who knows a lot less thinks they're a lot further ahead, right?
Yeah.
But the person who's truly an expert recognizes how little they know, and that can manifest into a lack of confidence. And that's what we want to get in the way of, is we accept our level of competence, but understand the value of knowing what we want and trusting our own ability to get after that.
Yeah. And when you say get after that, you mean almost like a put our own best foot forward,
right?
As opposed to trying to be a fortune teller. The reason I ask is, a lot of times in popular media, confidence is portrayed as the guy who's very certain about the outcome. Like, very rarely do you see classically confident characters in TV series talk about how they're going to put their best foot forward, and then whatever the outcome is, they'll be fine with it. Like, always, all the stereotypical confident characters on TV are always kind of giving guarantees and assurances about the outcome. And I think that sometimes leads people to conclude that confidence is about predicting the outcome with certainty.
Yeah, no, it's really about trusting in your own ability for yourself. And I think the reason it's portrayed as, I guess, being able to predict the outcome itself is, again, in a TV series, right? Someone's writing that script.
Yeah.
They can say that and they can actually back it up. But in your life, you're actually the person writing the script. And based on what you believe about the experience, the script changes, but you're also not in full control of the script itself. And what's interesting about what you said about not being a fortune teller as well, even when people feel a lack of confidence, they are still doing fortune telling, but just in a negative direction. Where fear, uncertainty, doubt comes up. What if this happens? What if I go speak to this person and they don't want to speak to me? Or what if I ask my boss for promotion and instead I get fired, right? So in a way, we're always doing a sense of fortune telling, and that's, again, a lack of presence, right? Not being in the current moment. And, you know, as Eckhart Tolle talked about in Power of Now, it's really losing touch with the present is what creates the fortune telling. So I think it's important to understand that as well, because there's this bias that, oh, if I believe something positive, who am I to believe this, right? But if I believe something negative, it's like, oh yeah, of course, this is normal. Whereas we want to switch the normal into, okay, why wouldn't I believe something positive?
Yeah. And I guess that also ties into the idea of loss avoidance, right? Like, losing a certain amount of whatever metric we're going by versus winning a certain amount of the metric we're going by, that loss brings us a lot more pain and the win brings us the joy.
Right.
And so I think maybe that's where people are willing to prioritize that negative fortune telling more.
Yeah.
Yeah. But at least from what I'm understanding, it seems like this isn't about completely eradicating the idea of fortune telling either. It's more about resetting it to almost a more useful version that isn't overly positive, where you don't just wake up thinking, oh, I'll beat the world number one at any sport any day. But you also don't want to wake up thinking, no matter how much hard work I put in, I'm destined to lose.
Right.
And you just want kind of a healthy middle ground where you know you're going to do your best, and oftentimes your best is good enough.
Right.
And if it isn't, you'll be fine either way. But really having a healthy level of positive expectation is kind of would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think, to take a step back, like there's 4 types of systems in terms of filtering information you take from reality, right? Or from your current experience. The first type of system is an ego-based system. So this is about filtering information in about what you want, and that becomes a primary driver. At a biological sense, this is what people call like the lizard brain, right? I want to control my lizard brain or build a better habit and discipline myself. And an ego-based system can still be very good. Like you may want something like world peace.
Yeah.
So it's not just like I want ice cream or I want to date a lot of girls. It can be something very positive. We're just looking at the content of the system, which is about something that you desire or something that you don't. And that's what we start with when we experience the world. Like when you're born into the world, you just receive information, right? And at first, you come in from the first person perspective, which is you don't feel a sense of separation between who you are and what the environment is. And at a certain point, you realize you have the ability to navigate the environment to get what you want.
Yeah.
So if you look at a kid who's like 3, 5, 7 years old, probably not 7 actually, 3 to 5 years old, if you hold their favorite toy, they might just smack you to get the toy. It's not because they don't have morals. It's because they don't physically understand Numer is a different person.
Yeah.
What they know is if I do this, I get this toy.
Okay.
That's when an ego-based system arises, right? It's one of the earliest systems.
So is it fair to say an ego-based system is almost like a little bit of a black and white encoding of life, of I do this, this happens like this, systematic cause and effect. But the reason it's not amoral is because morals almost come up in context in relation to other people and relation to others. And because this idea of relation to others doesn't even exist, it's like, it's not that there's no morals, it's just that the concept doesn't even exist, so that we can't even talk about it.
Right. So, well, in the context of a kid, because they're in first person perspective. But you and I are still using ego-based systems, right? We're not going to have broccoli tonight for dinner. Why? Because we don't want to have broccoli. And of course, we can look at the data and say, vegetables, lots of pesticides. So we can still use more sophisticated systems. But in any stage of development, you can use, based on how developed you are, either 2, 3, or 4 of these systems.
Right.
But as a kid, it's because they don't see that there is an I inside this other person, that this other person has a mind, right? So then when you get to around second person perspective is when you start having belief-based systems.
Okay.
And this is the most level from which people talk about confidence. They want to build a belief in themselves.
Could you explain what a belief, what do we mean by second person perspective here?
Yeah, so second person perspective is I can see myself and I can also see you.
Okay.
So a good switch in second person, like usually when kids switch from first person to second person, what happens is instead of hitting someone to get the toy, they'll actually leave the toy to the other kid to make a friend.
Okay.
Because now they see, oh, just like me, the shapes and colors that are moving, this is a person.
Okay. And so whatever, is it fair to say in this system, whatever heuristics around good and bad that they have about themselves, they start applying to the second person. So it's like, I like this toy, therefore that letting that person have that toy
Right.
is also good. So it's almost limited because you see yourself, you see the other person, but the
Well,
best you can do is apply your own heuristics.
yeah, the issue is they don't have beliefs, right? So they don't even know what good and bad is at that time.
Okay.
That happens through that switch.
They
They just give the toy out of like, oh, maybe this will work.
This will work to get the toy back,
or make a friend, maybe.
Okay.
And that depends on like how they have been trained through their family. So if someone grows up in a very abusive family, right, they might think, oh, this is how I make friends.
Yeah.
They might try that, but that doesn't work. So it's not a very concrete belief system just yet. They're just stepping into that world.
Yeah.
And then throughout that evolution, they usually build stronger beliefs. So that's where beliefs like, hey, don't talk to strangers, they might be dangerous, right? You can have a belief like that, and that's a belief-based system. Or you could have a belief like, oh, don't speak too loud because that means you're disturbing other people. So these are not just negative beliefs or just positive beliefs. There's tons of different beliefs.
Yeah.
And this is initially what creates a culture, right? Because the belief that, hey, if the traffic light is red, don't cross the street is what keeps people alive.
Yeah. So it's almost you have a set of beliefs and then you make interactions with the world governed by this set of beliefs. And then because you can see that there's other people who are also eyes, your beliefs can kick in around how you treat them. And that's why you're no longer smacking them.
Right.
Because the act of smacking before just meant something very different. But now that you have beliefs, you can have positive or negative interpretations of smacking someone. Would you say that's the biggest difference between?
Yeah, so the difference between an ego-based and belief-based system is ego is more about what I want and what I don't want.
Right.
Belief is more about what I believe is possible.
Okay.
So you can have conflict between different types of systems. Like I might want to eat ice cream, but I believe if I eat, 3 tubs of ice cream a day, I'll get fat.
Right.
So then what do I do? Right?
Yeah.
So in that sense, you get this ability to think a little bit more long-term as well. And then through the beliefs, it creates more organization. The reason I bring that up is I think most people look at building confidence from this level, but there is also a more evolved system, which is a thought-based system. And this is about looking at the data and looking at reality and doing reality checks like, oh, okay, I believe I can go to a public speaking conference and give a speech in front of, 100 people, let's say. But then instead of just believing that and feeling confident, I also go test that out, right?
Right.
So when people talk about confidence, if they don't do also reality checks with their environment, that's when they're unable to build competence. So they have confidence, but it's like this big balloon that can explode anytime.
Yeah.
And their confidence is not necessarily based on anything concrete.
Yeah. Okay. I see. So with the confidence, or I guess traditional approaches to confidence, it was all about how can I have this belief that I can do this, or how can I have this belief that if I go to a contest, I can, eat 15 pizzas in a certain amount of time. Like,
Right.
It's all about having that belief. And then the reason that definition or that approach can get us into trouble is because if it's not reality checked, then you can just be another person who's sitting at home who believes he's like a super genius
Right.
and should be given control of every big company in the world.
Right.
But it's if you don't reality check it, then you can either be put in the situation and then things go terribly wrong, or just never end up creating the ideal situations because
Yeah.
confidence was almost drilled as the end all. And so it just became about believing and then leaving it at that.
Yeah, and the problem with that is beliefs are not as flexible. So someone can believe that they're good at talking to people, but to hold on to that belief, they may not even leave their house. Because if they have a real world experience that where they go and try to speak to someone and no one pays attention, that conflicts their belief, right? And that's a
Right.
very disturbing experience
Yeah.
for someone who holds that belief. So the problem with just building confidence at a belief system is it can create short-term results, but it can also put you into a box over time where you only start doing things that you feel confident in. And you
Right.
actually run deeper and deeper away from your own fears.
Yeah.
It's actually very common for people in tech, right? You may get really good at your software engineering job.
Yeah.
You've always been
Like a
almost
child prodigy who
yeah, a
doesn't do
child
much.
prodigy who's been saying, "Oh, you're so smart. You're so good
Yeah.
at this.
You're
How
so
are you?
special.
Yeah, how are you so good at math and physics? Oh,
Yeah.
wow, this took me like, 100 hours to learn. How do you solve this in like 2 hours?" Then what happens from that? They believe that, and there's some truth to that. But then what happens? They struggle with socializing, with dating, and what do they think? Oh, I got this on my own because I am a smart person. And that belief actually prevents them from building competence in a new area because, yes, they're an intelligent person, but in this area, they don't have the expertise.
Yeah.
So that's why being able to also tap into a thought-based system and actually go, okay, here's what I believe about myself, but what does my experience say? What does the data say? What
Yeah.
does the scientific studies, not just what the ones you believe in,
Yeah.
but the actual research, what does that say?
Yeah.
Right? And that's when we can build confidence while also stepping into our fears and building competence, which creates a deeper loop of confidence because now we feel confident in more areas.
Yeah.
And confidence becomes our default state, not just something we feel in constrained environments.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the reason that also stands out to me was because was this one of the disturbances? Innocence, genuinely being as a disturbance, gave me a lot of like comfort because there were a few times I was like, okay, I've genuinely never been in this situation before,
Right.
and I did something rather stupid. And then I was like, well, what does this mean? And so, that was very interesting to see. But what I really wanted to, I guess, explore is what would you say some existing popular methods of building confidence, but ones that only do it on the belief level are?
Yeah, I think,
Would you say affirmations?
yeah, affirmations is an interesting one because with an affirmation, it's kind of like imagine trying to feed yourself broccoli and you can see this is broccoli, but you tell yourself it's steak, right? No, it's broccoli. We could see it. Like, come on now, you're being ridiculous. When you try to use affirmations to force feed yourself a belief, it's no different than doing that, right? Because if deep down you have this sense of, let's say, not being interesting enough, and you look in the mirror and you go, I am such an interesting guy. I'm the most interesting person in the world. What that does is it actually accidentally builds a belief that you're also a liar because deep down you're lying to yourself, right? So
Right.
people do it with one intention but end up getting a different result. And in that sense, that's why it's a very easy thing to create a short around. Like, oh, you feel not good enough, use this affirmation.
You are enough. You are
Yeah.
loved.
or you listen to
Like
like an
our Steam
hour-long
Bug.
compilation with binaural beats, right?
Yeah.
That can feel really good. And if your whole goal is, hey, I want to feel really good in this moment, then go ahead, you can use it.
Well, plenty of other more tangible ways to also spike that feeling of goodness
That's
in a
right.
short period of a time.
Eating oysters, it's
Yeah.
Dr. Namar's favorite. So you can use it still, but
Yeah.
the realistic and most effective way to use affirmations is actually doing them in a way where they reality check your beliefs.
Yeah.
So let's say that you have a belief that you are the most interesting person or you are the most boring person in the world, right?
Right.
You look at other people, you're like, oh, they're so much more interesting than me. You go through social media, you see someone, playing golf, flying in a private plane, visiting different countries every day, and you think, oh, they're living
Riding
such
a
a good
jet
life.
ski.
Yeah, riding a jet ski with a suit.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you think, oh, they live such an interesting life. And what about me? I don't live life that way. In that moment, what you can do is you can use an affirmation, but what you want with your affirmation is three things. The first thing is you want it to be truthful, right?
Right.
There is no part of your affirmation that feels like a lie to you. So, for example, I can tell myself, I may feel like the most boring person in the world, but I genuinely have not met every single person in the world.
Yeah.
Which is true, right? You haven't met them. If you have, we haven't
We're
met
curious,
you.
yeah.
We want to have you on the podcast. And the second thing you want is it's believable to you.
Yeah.
And some things are true, but they're hard to believe. Like, let's say you're a part of a software engineering team, and they do an IQ test, and turns out you're the smartest, highest IQ person in the team, right?
A being of supreme intelligence.
Yeah. Now, that could be proof on paper, and it is true. But if someone told you, hey, you're the smartest person in the room, you may not believe it.
Yeah.
So we want it truthful and believable. And then we want it to be useful, right?
Yeah.
Because if it's not useful, then it doesn't create a positive emotional state. So if you don't feel confident, like one of the things I did super early on, even before I knew this, is I realized that the way people judge how you feel internally is simply based on the external signals that you communicate, right? In a very simplified way, obviously. And what I realized was when I was deeply terrified to speak to someone I was interested in, if I just went ahead and did that, most of the time, everyone around me would see that act as an act of confidence.
Yeah.
So I didn't have to feel confident deep down to display a confident action.
Yeah.
But if I displayed that confident action at some point, because that action was coming from me, I would start feeling confident.
Yeah.
So things like that are things you can play with. And again, when it comes to things like affirmations or like those, audios where you on YouTube, sometimes they show up, right? 1 hour audio to be a stoic man. And it's like, you are strong in this, and Viking music. They're great ways to feel good, but they don't really lead to long-term change. And there's a reason why those videos have millions of views, but there's not millions of people who are feeling happy, confident, and peaceful all the time.
Yeah. And I think on this topic, it also reminds me of addressing on a belief-based system, like parents who tell their kids like they're good at everything, they're the most special, which obviously very nice to have.
Yeah.
But I've seen examples where it can be taken to the extreme, where people just automatically assume they're already good at something. And then when they collide with reality, it's like a whole other story.
Yeah.
And I think that's where reality checks, as well as balancing confidence with competence, is very, very important, because part of me did feel like in the quest for finding confidence, nobody, or not nobody, but we stopped talking about actually building competence.
Right.
Like it became so much about confidence and reframe,
Right.
and rarely was it actually said, well, go put in 100 more reps of
Right.
something so that you're actually good at the thing.
Yeah.
And then we don't need to have this long emotional session about, am I confident or not?
Right. Yeah, it's like a feedback loop between confidence and competence. And if one of those elements are, weak, it's kind of like riding a motorcycle, but only your front wheel has air and your back wheel is just like nothing.
Yeah.
That motorcycle is not going to go very far or very fast.
Yeah. And so I guess another thing to touch on that was interesting was looking at confidence from a belief-based system, how that affects a lot of guys who kind of grow up being very, very good at one thing, but then how that can lead to drawbacks in other aspects of their life. Could you touch on that more? Because I think even for me, for the longest time, I felt like, this was something other guys were just born with.
Right.
And therefore I'm behind the curve, and I kind of just have to make my peace with being good at athletics and being good at, what's it called, career/professional things.
Right.
And then, I've seen other guys have it with just being good at athletics, just being good at career. But then I've also seen guys have it the other way around, being like, oh, I'm very good at charming people and talking to them, but I need someone else to handle, like, quote unquote, the science and stuff. So could you talk about how this belief-based system can actually hamstring us when it comes to becoming a well-rounded person?
Yeah, again, with beliefs, they're very rigid, right? And the more we hold on to the belief, the harder it is to explore something outside of that belief system. So in that sense, if I believe that I'm the guy who's good at athletics and then nothing else, then I don't even try to explore the other areas.
Right.
Which, if you don't explore something, of course, it's more difficult to get
Yeah.
good at something you haven't explored.
Yeah.
And I think that's where it's a bit of a catch-22, in the sense that if you have a very strong beliefs, you don't really question it, right?
Yeah.
You can question beliefs that are actually easier to question. But if you really believe something, then that tends to be tied to who you think you are.
Yeah.
And that can be a philosophical discussion for another time.
Yeah.
But I think some way to play with that, if that's something people struggle with, is seeing the times and really paying attention to when that belief doesn't hold.
Yeah.
So for example, one thing, I didn't even know about reality checks at the time, but again, when I started approaching strangers, I was going to school at UCLA, and I basically speak to like 3-5 people a day. Sometimes have lunch with someone I just met in the dining hall. Sometimes like give a compliment and leave.
Yeah.
Sometimes I would have a few minutes of conversation and maybe we'd be friends or we'd go on a date, right? One thing I noticed was every time I had a belief, I told myself, okay, let me actually see if that's true.
Yeah.
So if I believed, oh, this person's on the phone, if I go tell them something, they're just going to blow me off.
Yeah.
I thought, okay, that's a fair belief, but I don't actually know if that's true.
Yeah.
So let me go and find out.
Yeah.
And I think that attitude of let me actually go and find out is so valuable. But when you are finding out, it's also not about having a breakthrough experience the first time.
Yeah.
Right? If you think, like, if you don't have practice with something, you do it for the first time, rarely you're going to perform extremely well.
Yeah.
So when we say, let me go out and find out, it's about committing to 3 months, 6 months,
Yeah.
a year sometimes.
Yeah. I almost think of it as like expecting the first time you try something to fully contradict your belief is like expecting to win the Nobel Prize on your first experiment and the first data collection from your first experiment. And that's where I felt like being trained in statistics and a kind of understanding sample size really helped me. because I felt like I saw some other people who would have rather wild conclusions about why something would never work. But then you ask them, well, how many times did you try it? And then the answer would be like low single digits.
Right.
Versus,
Yeah, I spoke to one girl on the street, and it's just women don't want to be spoken to
Yeah.
during the day, man.
versus I'd be like, well, what's a healthy sample size we'd want? Let's say 100 or something, right?
And as a man of science, you just need to do what people
Yeah, got to do it for the gram.
want.
And so that makes, I guess, using empirical data from the outside world to really question our beliefs is very valuable. But then could we start talking about how can we start using this data from the external world to baby step ourselves into confidence? Because obviously, let's say we start taking action and we're doing a really good job. We're taking action even though we're not feeling 100% confident. Something I found really valuable in my journey was how can we use the small wins to set ourselves up for the big wins? So could you touch on how we can take even the smallest experiences and the smallest positives and use that to kind of help us build more confidence?
Yeah. So whenever you're doing something new or you're checking a belief with what actually happens in the external world, you want to almost have a little bit of bias towards the positive, right? So, for example, let's say you're terrified to speak to people and you don't think they'll be interested. You tell someone, hey, how's it going? And you walk away. And they say nothing. You could say that as, like, you could take that as proof, oh, this doesn't work. Or you could pay attention to something completely different and say, okay, that wasn't the end of the world.
Yeah.
I felt anxious for a few seconds or a few minutes, but now my heartbeat is normal. The rest of my day is exactly the same. And same experience can have a very different story attached to it based on your perspective. So having a glass half full attitude, even if the glass at 40% or 30% is actually
greater than zero.
Is actually really good. It's funny you say that because one of the first mentors I worked with, he had this thing where he would say 1 is bigger than 0. And it was super simple, but his point was even if you go out one night and you speak to one person, that's better than 0. And it's really not like we're not about chasing a peak experience every single time, right? And just like going to the gym, it's not going to be that one workout where you hit a PR and everything, but it's going to be like maybe one more rep you did on one of the accessory exercises. But you do that over and over again, you see your body transform. And it's the same thing with any skill. So we want to pay attention to that. Because also, whatever we pay attention to the most, and when we can go and celebrate, okay, I had this conversation, maybe it didn't end up in a long conversation, but this time I spoke to someone for 1 minute. Versus the first time I was like, I'm getting out of here after 5 seconds, right? Being able to see that is so powerful. And the more you see that, the more motivation you can create, right? The biggest problem people face is, oh, I don't have the motivation to do this. It's because they don't actually pay attention to the things, to the proof that would allow them to generate the motivation. So in a way, part of building confidence and competence is being able to almost brainwash yourself a little bit into being positive. And I didn't know how powerful that was until, I started coaching, because although I've been to the depths of struggle and anxiety and doubt and being fat and addicted to video games, I was always a positive person. So if I spoke to someone and I was afraid, I'd be like, hey, I did it. That's good. And that led to this incredible journey. And that's when I realized, like, okay, protecting this almost like childlike innocence and sense of celebration of like, yay, we did something new, is so important. And it's such a big part of building confidence.
Right. And I'm happy you touched on the aspect of celebration, Because I think the next thing I was going to ask was, how does being very particular or being very sincere with celebrating your wins, which in some sense I think goes against the grain of the traditional self-development, right? Because traditional self-development is all about disciplining, punishing yourself. And it talks about being very sincere about those things.
Right.
But how does being very sincere about celebrating your wins, even the smallest ones, around, I did this, I went 5% more than I did previously, how does that help not only build confidence, but also competence, but then on top of that, help us achieve the outcomes we want? Because even confidence is only relevant in the context of achieving a certain outcome a lot of times. So could you talk about why celebrating even the smallest wins, like the smallest increments, what role does that play?
Yeah. When it comes to any skill or any experience of life, usually we come back to things that create a positive experience, right? Whether that's a type of food that you like. You like steak, the way you cook it, not the way they make it in the restaurant you went to a couple of days ago. And you come back to that experience because once you've had that in the past, it felt good. Eventually, it becomes a habitual tendency.
Right.
Now, if we're working on building a skill and the default of that process starts with fear because we're afraid, then if we can inject that with more positivity, over time, the collective experience of the time we spend on that skill becomes more positive.
Okay.
So if we create that experience of the skill, eventually the default emotional state shifts, right?
Right.
And once it shifts, it's like you have more positive memories attached to the skill. That's why people who force themselves to the gym, what happens usually if they stay consistent for like a couple of months, suddenly they look forward to going to the gym. Suddenly they get excited because they can see their progress. Or even the thing about meeting people, right? Once you start overcoming your fears, it can almost turn into its own addiction in some cases, where you get excited about meeting new people. So I think when we celebrate, we hit that benchmark quicker because we're also owning our power to dictate this experience and not handing that power away to any external outcome.
Yeah, so I guess, so to break this down more, it's almost like intentionally celebrating is more about revisiting a certain positive neural pathway that strengthens the certain state state or experience that is associated with doing the activity. And the more we can strengthen not just enjoyment, where I guess celebrating the win is enjoying the win, but the more we can also just celebrate the win for the win itself, is it fair to say then we're also cementing the positive expectation of wins by visiting wins more? So we're almost building confidence in a sense because by celebrating wins and by strengthening that neural pathway, we are strengthening the neural pathway of winning or expecting a win and having positive uncertainty.
Yeah.
So by celebrating our wins, we're almost building confidence more because we're actually just training ourselves to have positive expectation.
Yeah. You're creating like your own winner's effect, right?
Yeah.
Without basing it on a certain outcome. And if you look at anyone at the top of their field, part of that, what sets them apart is this ability to tap into that at any moment.
Yeah.
Like you look at Michael Jordan or Kobe or things like that, right?
Yeah.
They have this ability to, even if they miss like 15 shots in a row, it comes to the end of the game and they can take that shot with full confidence. And if one of those goes in, suddenly they like score on your team 20 points straight without you even recognizing what happened.
Yeah. And so along those lines, I guess we talked about creating it with one win, but can we also celebrate the upward trajectory we're on So then our default becomes extrapolating further upwards.
Right.
So then we just expect ourselves to progress even more. So but in addition to celebrating individual wins, celebrating almost how far we've come, can that train us to expect us to keep progressing upwards and expecting more and more? And that's when we truly believe like we're going to get there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, as long as that expectation doesn't create a sense of pressure.
Yeah.
And you don't switch the other way and you go, oh, this is what I was expecting, but I hit a plateau. And I think another way also is seeing that, like for me, whenever I worked with any mentor, some people go, oh yeah, this was possible for you, but I don't know if it's possible for me. I would always go, hey, if this guy did it, I mean, we're born from the same thing. We're the same species.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't it work for me? Right?
Yeah.
And I think looking at people who have changed their own lives, who you get inspired by, and seeing that if this was possible for them, then this is also possible for me.
Yeah.
Now, it's not a probable thing if you're not dedicated and you're just expecting it to happen. But with dedication, whatever transformation they had, there is nothing concrete that stops you from having that transformation and even more, right? And you can see this even with like the 5-minute mile or 6-minute mile.
Yeah.
Where it was a record that wasn't broken for a long time and someone did it. And I think in the same year, like a few more people did it.
Yeah.
And I think in that sense, when we can look at others who inspire us and take their story as a reason to believe in ourselves, realizing that this is a human, I'm a human, why can it be possible for me?
Yeah, it reminds me of the quote from Iron Man 2 where the villain tells Robert Downey Jr. that if you can make God bleed, there will be blood in the water and the sharks will come. And it's almost like with a lot of these records, nobody believed it, but then one person broke it by just a little bit. And then suddenly everyone believed it was possible. And then it just kept getting like, the record just kept getting broken. And then what was really interesting about that was I felt like, again, not having done a thorough research on this, but there were a lot of arguments for why scientifically we would never be able to surpass this milestone.
Yeah, I remember that as well.
Like it gets broken and then the science gets almost re-refined to reset.
Right.
Because I think a lot of times people will constrain their belief in what's possible based on the science,
right,
but not see it the other way around, see how the science also gets refined.
Yeah, so what happens with science actually is a thought-based system gets interpreted from a belief, right? That's why Einstein said you can never separate someone's conclusions in their research based on their own personal story.
Yeah.
Because the belief is always intertwined to the conclusion.
Yeah, like inductive bias.
So that's the thing, is because science is a word that people use usually at that level of development when they have thought, people have a bias towards thinking that means it's a thought-based system on real data.
Yeah.
But you can't actually take science, a sophisticated mechanism, to justify your beliefs. And in a way, that's what the news does as well. But that's not our subject to cover.
Yeah.
But it is something to be aware of. Don't believe something just because it says science.
Yeah.
Because that word could still be used to convince you of a belief that the person believes.
Yeah, especially as like coming from an academic background and seeing a lot of studies and then reading an article, someone else who doesn't come from a scientific background wrote about the study, I'd be like, bro, did you even read it? It's like two completely separate things.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think that's one thing that's very important to be careful about is, I guess a lot of times that's when I'll tell people, hey, are you actually using the scientific method to arrive at a certain conclusion? Or are you kind of using 30% of the scientific method and then stopping whenever the analysis gives you a favorable enough conclusion to confirm what you want to believe?
Right.
And I guess I think one disclaimer I do want to say is with, the 5-minute mile, there was, science did get redefined, and there are certain absolutes that we're willing to acknowledge around, like,
Right, maybe
no,
not a 2-minute mile.
yeah, or like 1 second mile. At that point, you're just moving at the speed of light. Just unless you just magically wake up as the Flash or something. Which, I mean, hey, or even swimming underwater for like 6 hours straight.
Right.
There are limitations, but understanding where the edge cases really are versus understanding what the reasonable cases in your own life really are. Because I think a lot of times in our own life, the reasonable case is something quite as simple as, can I go to that networking event
Right.
and meet 5 people? It's not like, can I magically teleport to the moon and collect some samples and then come back, or
Right.
fly at the speed of sound? And so I think also having an awareness around whether you're in an edge case or whether you're just in more of a very reasonable case where there's a lot more flexibility.
Yeah.
It's important to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and knowing that edge case is dependent on your experience too, right?
Yeah.
If you build competence over time, someone's edge case might just be another day for you.
Yeah.
Now, that being said, I'm pretty confident we're about to run out of battery.
If you're a fish, your edge case is staying in water the whole day.
That's right. So, anything to wrap up this episode?
No, that was very insightful around confidence. And I think, what would you say for someone who feels like they want to feel more confident in their day-to-day lives? What would be a few places you recommend they start?
Yeah, I would say listen to this episode again, because I think the first time we listen to something, we don't digest it all. We covered a lot about using belief-based and thought-based systems, how to use affirmations the right way. And then if you guys want, we have a free playbook where we show you how to identify limiting beliefs that are getting in the way of your confidence and how to remove them. So you can check that out down below. But before we run out of battery, this is Ege.
This is Numer.
And this is the Data Driven Actualization podcast. Thanks for watching.